Writing a scientific paper or lab report is time-consuming work, but you can let time work for you. An hourglass is the perfect metaphor for what you are trying to achieve. Basically, every scientific text consists of 4 parts: the introduction and discussion, and in the middle, the methods and results sections. And it's these 2 sections in the middle that give the scientific paper a typical hourglass shape. In the methods section, you only describe the methods of your experiment, your tools, your procedures, nothing else. In the results section, you present the data of your experiment, figures, graphs, photos, etc. Nothing more. The paper is therefore very narrow and focused. The introduction and discussion, however, should include a lot broader ideas. Let's take a detailed look at the introduction. It starts out broad and ends up narrow. This is because it needs to lead into the methods and results sections. In a way, an introduction is like a cup or goblet that you can fill with lots of relevant ideas. It seems that it doesn't have a bottom. So it's not a goblet after all, but a funnel. Every idea you throw into your introduction should lead towards your experiment. That means ideas should follow one another logically, because only then do they turn into a golden thread that takes the reader by the hand and leads him or her through your manuscript. The point of the golden thread, therefore, is to connect 2 points. Let's call them point A and point B. In the introduction, point A is at the beginning and point B at the end. But apparently, there's a tricky part in the middle, which we shall call the middle part. But thinking in these 3 discrete parts helps to make it clear what we are trying to achieve with an introduction. Only when your ideas follow logically from one part to the next have you written a proper introduction to your scientific study. This is what the golden thread is all about. Let me try to make this a little bit clearer with the help of a pine cone. Say, you start out with the word cone, and you know your study is about the word How do you get from cone to word? That's the tricky part of writing introductions. Here, let me give you a hint. There are some bits in the beginning of your introduction that already determine where it will lead. Now, we're getting closer to our goal. All we need is a cord to connect the dots. See? With every paragraph of our introduction, we moved a bit closer to what our study was about. So all our introduction needed to make it clear what we are studying and why was a cord. Or rather, the golden thread. Okay, we'll try with a real-world example, again using a bunch of pine cones. We have to go back to 1932 for this example, and to a scientist called Nico Tinbergen. He studied an animal called the bee wolf. No, not the beowulf. This is actually a wasp that lives in the ground where it feeds its young with the corpses of honeybees. Nico noticed that when the wasp leaves the nest to go foraging, it circles above the nest every time before it finally takes off. And when it returns, it immediately homes in on its nest. So Nico wondered why the wasp circled its nest before leaving. Could it be that it wants to memorize what the nest looks like? So what Nico suddenly had was a scientific question, which he followed up on by designing and performing an experiment. He dropped a number of pine cones around the nest when the wasp was inside, and when it left again, it circled above the nest. Unsurprisingly, the wasp again homed in on its nest just like before. But then, he repeated the experiment, let the wasp do its bit of circling, and as soon as the wasp was gone, he moved the cones a little bit to the side. As he expected, when the wasp returned from its foraging flight this time, it flew straight to the wrong side. When Nico sat down to write his introduction, he had lots of ideas of things to put into his paper. But more importantly, he followed the hourglass structure by having distinct paragraphs that followed one another logically. In the beginning, he wrote about the general life history of the bee wolf. And he wanted it to lead to his question regarding the role of landmarks near the nest. But how did he get from general life history to his pinecone study? Here is what he did. First, he wrote about the reproduction behavior, then about the nesting behavior, and finally about that curious circling behavior he observed when the wasp left its nest. See what he did there? Let me show you. He started by writing about foraging for food and feeding its offspring. Then he wrote about how the wasp returned with dead bees to the offspring that were waiting inside the nest. Then he described how the wasp built its nest. And finally he arrived at the circling behavior when the wasp left its nest, which led him to the main question behind his experiment. His whole introduction revolved around the nest and the feeding of its offspring. His golden thread was the wasp behaviors that were necessary to feed the offspring inside the nest. So he started quite generally and slowly crept closer and closer to the very particular behavior he observed when the wasp left its nest. His introduction was a logical thread of ideas leading to the one idea essential for the whole study, his scientific question. Actually, he was a lot closer to the experiment already. Instead of a question, he posed an hypothesis. His study revolved around testing this hypothesis, and so this single specific idea could move the reader from the introduction into the methods section, and from there through the whole of the remaining manuscript. Now it's up to you. How do you turn your pine cone into your scientific question? That is the secret of a good introduction.